Caring for cultural heritage. I'm Clarissa Levy, Art and Heritage Counsel at Wedlake Bell.
And I'm Richard Harwood. I'm a barrister at 39 Essex Chambers.
And we're joined today by Dr. Charlotte Woodhead, Associate Professor at Warwick Law School. Charlotte, thanks so much for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me.
We have called this episode of the podcast Caring for Cultural Heritage after your book, which is now out, I should start by saying, in paperback, Caring for Cultural Heritage, an integrated approach to legal and ethical initiatives in the United Kingdom. So my first question is always the most basic. What is cultural heritage and why do we care for it?
Well, really, it's those objects, places and practices that mean something to us. They may link with our identity, our sense of place, our sense of belonging, and they can often be very complex. They mean different things to different people. And much of the cultural heritage that we know and love is probably quite obvious. Few would object to Stonehenge, the Parthenon or Palmyra being cultural heritage. So sometimes it's a case of knowing it when we see it. But I think we sometimes overlook the cultural heritage that is part of our daily lives, that we live with, that we practice, and we think just about the monumental. But really it's about passing it on to future generations, that idea of the intergenerational nature of it. And I've been looking at it from the concept of caring for it, because we care about it. And really this idea of care has been around a long time. We use it often in policies, caring for human remains, caring for collections. And even back in 1905, there was a book by Gerald Baldwin Brown called Care of Ancient Monuments. But we don't always think about what we mean by it. And so that's what I hope to do in this book, is spend some time thinking about how we care through the law as well.
And Charlotte, one thing you're very careful to do in the book is to distinguish between a description of cultural heritage and the expression cultural property. Do you want to explain why you prefer the expression cultural heritage to cultural property?
I think it's a case of putting the cart before the horses sometimes if we talk about property rather than heritage. The word heritage brings with it the notion of inheritance, of passing on, of something that's important to us. And if we just focus on the property aspect of it, we think a bit too much about the possession and the ownership of it, which can be contested at times. So it will often have the characteristic of being property, but really that doesn't encompass the broad different types of heritage that we have, the practices from Morris dancing to cheese rolling, all sorts of things that we practice, as well as the tangible that we can see in a museum or visit.
And also, there's a point you come to a number of occasions, I think, in the book, that the question of ownership may have very little to do, or perhaps nothing at all to do in some cases, with actually the heritage interest of the item. And the resolution of ownership disputes, obviously important to the participants and potentially important to the future of the item or the object or the building or whatever it is, may not actually involve heritage considerations. So I can see why he said, well, actually, ownership does come into these issues sometimes, but it's not actually why it's important or why we're caring for it.
That's true. And sometimes cases do come down to the very basics. The old Flow case, the Tower Hamlets and Bromley case, that was about the ownership of a Henry Moore sculpture. And the judge was very clear about saying this is a question of ownership. And although one of the parties was keen for it to remain in the public domain, the other was at that time keen to sell it. And so the heritage considerations really were secondary. And how I look at that sort of case in the book is to think about whether it was appropriate care in the circumstances, because even though it's a question of ownership and the courts have to apply property law rules, nevertheless, it's a type of care that takes place.
I think that's a good illustration because, and this is, I think, one that sort of the property law students will do very early on and so on. Was it part of the land and degree of attachment? To extent part of the purpose of attachment and design issues. And that's a little bit of a mention of the heritage side, all very interesting, that the other edition in Stuttgart was the same value as the edition here in a GLC housing estate in East London, as it originally was. dispute was resolved in favour of Tower Hamlets on the basis that even though it hadn't passed to them under the Limitation Act, it was too late for Bromley, who the residue of the Greater London Council, to take it. But that property dispute between Bromley and Tower Hamlets wasn't a dispute which was resolved into how you deal with it best in heritage terms. At the time, Tower Hamlets were coming over as the Philistines who just wanted to sell it off. But it could easily have been Bromley who said, well, actually, yes, we're responsible for it and we'll want to sell it off. It just then gets resolved later on. It's now back in East London within the Canary Wharf scheme.
It's interesting for a number of reasons, really, that case, in the sense that that idea of keeping it in East London was a really interesting one, and the strength of feeling of keeping it in East London by the local community, when in fact it had been on loan for many years to the Yorkshire Sculpture Park as well. So it had been away from home for quite some time. But also I think the Tower Hamlets case is similar to a couple of other cases which have involved heritage, such as the Wedgwood collection or the Butler collection of Chinese vases. And those again came down to questions of ownership and whether it was, in the Butler case, constructed, and indeed in the Wedgwood case, constructed as collections that were separate and could be kept together, or whether it was property that could be sold off for different reasons. And so in those cases, property law in effect trumps any heritage interest, any wider interest. And so those are examples where there isn't quite as appropriate care of heritage, but the law is part of the whole story of heritage.
The property law decides, in a sense, who can decide. If you're not subject to regulation, we're going to come onto all of these things, not subject to listed building control or other regulatory control, then it's the owner who decides whether to sell it or where it goes and so on.
And that's where rights come in as well. Obviously, those are the property rights, but with rights also come responsibilities as well. And I think what's interesting is that on a wider scale, owners of heritage places or objects not only rely on their strict legal rights at times, but they go beyond those and they take on responsibilities, additional ones, because they care about the heritage and want to care for it, but also recognise that wider community interest as well in heritage.
This is why you hear so many owners of historic properties in the UK and elsewhere not describing themselves as owners, but as custodians. And so there is a bit of a shared understanding of, I think, what is appropriate care, which is something that you really drill down into in your book, Charlotte. Would you like to tell us what appropriate care should be?
In terms of academic literature and the ethics of care, which is something I delved into for this work, they often call it meeting needs. And I felt that was a really low bar when it came to cultural heritage. Something more was needed. And I was trying to work out what care involves. And I came to the idea of appropriate care being empathetic, dialogic, and respectful. And another colleague, Andreas Pantazatos, talks about care and respect being the normative foundations of stewardship, but he saw those as separate things. But I think actually respect is all part and parcel of care. And the empathy and the dialogue is really important, because if you think about a situation where somebody's really well-meaning and they want to help, a family member, for example, or a good friend, and they're very keen to help, and they think that the way to help you is down a certain line, and they come along and they say, I'm going to go and I'm going to take you out for the day and spoil you rotten. They care about you, they care for you, they want to do that. But actually, the most appropriate care in that situation is for you to have a quiet day at home. And it wasn't empathetic, it wasn't respectful, it wasn't dialogic. They didn't ask about it. It was sort of imposed. And it's this idea of imposing things, even though it's well meant, it's not necessarily appropriate in the circumstances. And we see this at an extreme in this notion of paternalistic care. And Uma Narayan has talked about paternalistic care in the context of colonialism. And we have to be very careful with that. I'm conscious using this terminology of care that it can be seen as paternalistic, maternalistic, whichever way. And it's about, therefore, listening, being respectful, being empathetic to the other communities as well, because it's not just about caring for the thing or the place or the practice. It's heritage isn't anything without the people who are involved. And so it's also about those different communities as well. And so avoiding an unstinting view that I am best placed to care for this object in this particular situation forevermore is inappropriate care, because it's also important to revisit those questions of care and the responsibility for it, but also what's involved with it and whether it's appropriate.
And that, I think, brings us back to another basic question, really, of how exactly we do look after our cultural heritage in the UK. What are the rules and practices? You talk about nested practices. What does that mean?
Coming at this from a lawyer, you sort of tend to think about the rights, and I'm a property lawyer at heart, really, and the rights and principles. But it's not that simple or straightforward. It's messy. It really is. There are so many different layers of, different types of law. The late Norman Palmer would talk about them being a more fascinating area of law than this because of municipal laws, national laws, international laws, all the rest, planning, tax, everything. But not just from the point of view of the laws, but also from the point of view of guidance, policies. Richard, in the context of planning, how many different layers there are. But with heritage as well, we have museums with their codes of ethics that the professional bodies have agreed to, similarly with archaeologists, then institutional policies, all of these different documents. And so this idea that Joan Tronto, in her work on the ethics of care, mentioned nested practices of care quite fleetingly, actually. I've yet to find a big discussion of it. But for me, it really typified the messiness of this. And it's not dolls nested one inside the other. It's a messy nest, but it's there to care for heritage as a whole. And it's this kind of caring mess, if you like.
I think it's sort of reflective of different roles and different decision makers at different points. And what I wanted to touch on was the role of the courts, which is right to think of it as a supervisory role. The sort of civil courts dealing with the questions of ownership and really who has the control, rather than so much how it's exercised usually. And the courts in public law concerned with being steadfastly trying not to make the decision most of the time. They're certainly trying to avoid anything that looks like we're deciding the merits of something, but to be involved in asking, was the decision made lawfully? Was the regard had to the policies and so on? But you have the courts running in terms of, what's the future of an item? The court's not really actually being there to resolve the heritage decision.
That's true. In terms of the role of the courts, parties can use the courts instrumentally to care for heritage. In the Tower Hamlets case, of course, it was Bromley that would have cared for it in a slightly different way had they been successful. And so law is being used instrumentally there. But yes, they're not always going to be the final arbiter of what the appropriate care is in the circumstances. But it provides an element of the care. I think it provides that opportunity for communities who care about heritage to come forward and to challenge a decision that's been made. And it might not be the substantive decision itself, but the procedural issues to do with that, which goes some way to allowing them to care for the heritage. So courts are indirectly caring for in many situations. But I think there are other examples of legal principles that are set up that give communities who care about heritage the tools to do something to the Localism Act and assets of community value, those sorts of things, setting things up as a collection if you want to, setting a charity up because you care about a place and want to make a go of it. And I think those are sort of the tools that communities can make use of. But the courts themselves, I think, are a community of care, just not always the most appropriate care providers in the circumstances.
And if you could wave a magic wand, Charlotte, to make a change in the way that we care for our cultural heritage in this country, perhaps as part of the court process or not, what would you do?
Well, I had this idea when I was doing my PhD, and it was an appendix of my PhD, a small piece of legislation that would require all decision makers, whether they were in the courts or whether they were on the Export Reviewing Committee or Spoliation Advisory Panel, all of these different situations where they were dealing with cultural heritage, to actually take into account the importance of it to different communities in different ways. And it was before I really focused on the notion of care. It was looking at the types of value and the principles underlying it. But I sort of put that together. But of course, the problem you then have is that can interfere with at times, private property rights. And of course, then that's a question for human rights as well. And the Article 1 of the first protocol of the European Convention on Human Rights is about that peaceful enjoyment of possessions. But we know it's qualified by that notion of protecting and preserving heritage as well. But that's one thought I've had. It's on the still mulling over in the mind, but it's not one that I would think would have broad appeal because we live in a common law, well, here in the UK with the different nations. Some matters are delegated, some matters are UK based, and then there's of course the courts as well that are dealing with heritage in all of these very different ways, and it's quite a fragmented system that we have.
So perhaps to summarise, you might say that it would be good to concentrate more on responsibilities than on strict legal rights. And you did also mention in your book that the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights gives us all the right to freely participate in the cultural life of the community and to enjoy the arts. So perhaps there is a way that all of these can be met.
Definitely. And the work that I've been doing has been very much UK focused. But colleagues across the world in the cultural heritage field, colleagues are looking at the legal provisions relating to how we look after heritage through international frameworks. And we can point to specific provisions of those international instruments many years ago, and those commitments are there and can be relied upon as well. But it's about how to apply those in domestic courts. So I'm really interested in how it can be used practically for communities who care about heritage. And sometimes it's not about having to go to the courts. It's just about finding the funding, finding the community support to take action. And I think that's where I found pockets of hope really in the system that we have, is that it facilitates communities who care about heritage to go out and get together and try and crowdsource some funding or work together, persuade developers who might have been taking one route to take a slightly different route, or to acquire places, or to make use of new devices such as conservation covenants and all sorts of things. So I think it's all of this different patchwork of things that will really enable people who seriously care about places or objects dear to their hearts to actually do something to care for them.
There is a patchwork of relationships of control, and sometimes there are triggering events which bring things together and get things going. So earlier in the podcast series, we were talking to Will Palin of Barts Heritage in terms of the restoration of the Great Hall and the Hogarth Staircase at St Bartholomew's Hospital. And Will was explaining that actually that the heritage effort there was triggered really by, in fact, a judicial review, which I happen to be involved in, about a scheme at St Bart's which was contentious. That was mediated, that got everyone together, and bringing forward that sort of initiative, which is hopefully going to be hugely successful. But we've had that, the big houses, Wentworth Woodhouse, I think, is quite a good example of absolutely massive property in Yorkshire, which has been sort of used and abused and left and so on, and is now coming forward with a huge amount of local community support and engagement and being converted and being restored. So it does become a major feature of the local community, as many of those houses have been.
And that just goes to show how central communities are to heritage as well. There's no point just keeping something in aspect, as the phrase used to be. It's about making it a living place that the community, even if it's creating a new type of heritage for future generations and a new use that's being made, it's about using heritage as well. And although a lot of what I was talking about in the context of heritage was about precautionary care to avoid the eventualities of war and the effect on heritage and preventing harm, it's also about just daily care as well, and using a place, using objects and practices to keep them going for future generations as well as for the current ones.
So going back to the challenges to cultural heritage, you mentioned the things that we're trying to avoid. Do you find that these nested practices are useful for navigating the areas of contestation and dissonance in caring for our cultural heritage?
Yes, I found, thinking about the wide range of areas of contestation. And I've tried to use this terminology of areas of contestation rather than contested heritage, because in some cases the heritage itself isn't contested. It's just issues around it are and cause problems. But I mean, it's as basic as designating heritage in the first place and what it is that we should care for and that we care about. Because often it will then, when we designate something as heritage, we set it apart and give it greater legal protection. Often we might restrict the owner's use of it in some way. And so that can be an area of contestation, just what's in the heritage mix and what's outside it. But it's also those real challenges that exist in terms of the physical harm to heritage, its possible loss and its destruction, whether that's during times of conflict or in peace times as well. But it's not just the physical things as well. We've got those really interesting provisions relating to protecting things like the views of St. Paul's Cathedral from different places as well. And that's done on different levels, isn't it, in terms of the legal system as well that's there. But as well as the harm from direct action in terms of intentional destruction, we also have that harm that's caused from inaction. Like you talked, Richard, about these places where communities get together to save a place. Often it's been left in decay for many years. And so it's a case of having to navigate harm that's been caused already and stop it worsening and to mitigate that. So it's also about responding to harm and loss, and the decontextualed objects is another one in terms of objects passing from conflict sites and the illegal trade in cultural objects. So it's about looking forward, trying to stop things happening in the first place, preventing them, sometimes responding, reactive care. Often that's the worst situation because you wish something had been in place beforehand, you're responding to it. It's just about mitigating the harmful effects. And then just that everyday care, the quotidian care, facilitating the use and enjoyment, the systems that we have in place to fund heritage preservation, to fund the use of places as heritage venues, to encourage flourishing, because heritage and human flourishing is so entwined as well. But it's also about encouraging the lending of works. So I've looked at things as far-ranging as the government indemnity scheme and the immunity from seizure legislation as well, that facilitates lending, because it's often said that art is a good ambassador and that we want to be lending objects. So all of these different aspects, I think, come under the care that we provide.
Not to mention tax.
Yes, and of course.
Never forgetting tax.
I wouldn't. Don't worry. I don't love tax quite as much as you do, Clarissa, but there's quite a lot on the way and that facilitates those private communities of care, because they want to take on responsibilities beyond their strict legal ones, that they want to provide access, but also it means it's a mechanism for keeping collections together, keeping objects associated with the place together through things like the conditional exemption scheme. So all of these things, in trying to look at the whole UK and how it cares for cultural heritage, it was quite a big task. And I kept finding more ways in which it was being cared for.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
It's certainly a huge topic.
Yeah.
And I keep coming back to thinking about the nests, Charlotte. I absolutely love that description of nested practices. And it tickles me to death to think of Richard's nest being a judicial review process and my nest being fairly tax-based.
So I think what comes out is a number of different participants in the process and the relationships between those. And as Clarissa just said now, trying to pull together cultural heritage law, especially actually when you're dealing with objects more than fixed structures, it is incredibly all different angles that sort of come into it. But something which I think also comes as a theme through that is the way in which heritage needs to be used. It needs to be live in the sense of active, not just something that's put away in a drawer in a cellar, that it has got to be experienced, whether it's by the owners of the house or the wider community or a mix of the two.
Certainly, and that's where sort of access to heritage is a fundamental concept as well that we see in the international legislation, and also those cases involving the European Court of Human Rights as well. Access was one of those elements which justified an interference with property rights. And we see this as well in those undertakings that owners of heritage places enter into with HMRC when it comes to conditional exemption as well. It's about preserving, about providing access, and about keeping it within the country so that it's accessible to the public as well. So those concepts are very strongly evident in the legislation that we have in place and the policies as well that underpin a lot of these.
It's a really nice balance that's struck actually with the conditional exemption scheme, because what that is, just to explain for anyone who's not familiar with it, is when inheritance tax, for example, would normally be payable, an object can be conditionally exempted from that tax if it is shared appropriately with the public. And what that means is that we all then have access to objects and land and buildings that we otherwise wouldn't. And it's very interesting looking at exactly what you've been saying, Charlotte, that there's a balance to be struck between preserving objects, so keeping them for future generations, but also using them. So when objects like houses, or indeed on a smaller scale, say, for example, musical instruments, are conditionally exempted from tax, they're still to be played, they're still to be lived in, they're still live heritage property. But just because they are exempted from tax and shared with all of us does not mean that we're creating mausoleums or setting these things in aspect, as you said.
Very much it's about keeping the memory of them alive as well, and keeping it as part of daily lives, really. And that's what heritage is. It's part of, you referred to the international statements about heritage and the importance of taking part in cultural life as well. And it's all part and parcel of that.
Charlotte, thank you so much for joining us, and please do get the book, which Sam and Clarissa have both been enjoying sort of reading it and learning a lot from it.
Well, thank you very much. It's been a real treat to come and talk to you both about heritage, so thank you very much.
Oh, lovely, Charlotte. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to the Art and Heritage Law Contested Heritage. Please do follow or subscribe on Apple or Spotify podcasts to enjoy more shows.
We have a new podcast out every fortnight. If you're able, please take the time to rate us and put down a review.
The show is also on the 39 Essex Chambers website, along with podcast series on topics such as artificial intelligence, climate change and planning.